First off, I want to start off by saying that although I won't be talking about story spoilers until the story section, you might see some stuff in the video that you haven't gotten to yet, so be warned. Hello everyone. Tears of the Kingdom has finally come out after 6 long years between the release dates of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Up until its release, it's probably the most hyped I've been for a game ever. And as of the time of making this video, I've played about 90 hours of it. The question is, did Tears of the Kingdom live up to being a sequel to Breath of the Wild, the most popular Zelda game to date and my second favorite? And the short answer is, yes. It absolutely did. It absolutely exceeded my expectations of what I expected it to be. I could go all in depth and make a 2-hour or some video about everything about this game, but I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to go over 4 major reasons of what makes Tears of the Kingdom the better Breath of the Wild. I will talk about 4 major parts of the game in this video. The exploration of the world, how Link moves, the story, and the dungeons. Now, although my opinion on this game is overwhelmingly positive, I definitely do want to bring up some flaws with it, even if I don't really have that many. Before I get into the video, if you like it here today, please give me a like and subscribe to get more Zelda content in the future. But with all that out of the way, let's talk about the world. Back when it released, Breath of the Wild had the largest world in any Zelda by a very wide margin. And the world itself was very fun to explore, which is probably why Breath of the Wild was so enjoyable to me, and why it's heralded as one of the greatest games ever made. Tears of the Kingdom took that already expansive world, and tripled it, basically. Now, in addition to the land of Hyrule, you can also explore the land above, and the land below. And similar to when I played Breath of the Wild, the size of Tears of the Kingdom's world absolutely astounded me. But now, let's talk about each layer individually, starting with the surface. Of course, the land of Hyrule is fun to explore. It was just like that in Breath of the Wild, and it definitely changes a lot of stuff to make it more enjoyable. Some of the areas in Tears of the Kingdom are different compared to how they were in Breath of the Wild. Death Mountain is now dormant compared to Breath of the Wild, where it was active. Now, instead of spewing with lava, it spews with gloom, which is basically this game's version of Malice. Or how the city of Tarrytown has greatly expanded and is now the primary construction company of Hyrule. Or how Lurelin Village has been taken over by pirates, and you need to fight a pirate force to be able to save it. I mean, obviously this isn't the only changes to Breath of the Wild's world, but those were a few of my favorites. In addition, there are now caves, wells, and sinkholes you can go into that opens up a little cave area to explore. And there are a ton of these. I obviously haven't managed to finish every single cave in the game. I mainly just went for the ones that I knew had shrines in them. But having actual caves to explore was really enjoyable. There were definitely quite a lot of ones I found interesting, and I'm excited to play more of them as I play the game more. There are some other things I want to talk about in regards to the world, but I'll wait to talk about that until after I talk about the other 2 layers. Another addition to the world of Hyrule are these pits that go down below Hyrule into an area called the Depths. Before the game got released, I don't really remember this being advertised that much. Really only the sky was a heavy part of advertising, which is weird because the Depths is essentially a second Hyrule beneath the surface. The Depths overall were pretty cool, but I definitely didn't enjoy all of it. Being deep beneath the surface of Hyrule, it obviously is very dark down there. And your whole goal is to fill out the map by going to light routes, which are the places of shrines beneath the surface. Being shrouded in darkness is pretty cool, but since your whole goal is to light up the area by going to light routes, you'll already be walking through much of the land in complete darkness. Now, if you want to see the whole world, you probably want it lit up. But there's really not much reason to go back after you've already gotten the light route of that area. And any area that contains a weapon or an armor piece from Zelda's history is pretty close to a light route anyway, so that's a pretty sizable chunk of land that really doesn't serve much purpose to explore. There are definitely interesting locales in the depths, but most of them, like I said, are pretty close to the light route, so you really just gotta teleport there to explore it rather than exploring the lay of the land yourself. You will be able to see some of the land while you're exploring the darkness because you will be having bright bloom seeds to throw, so it will light up a little bit the area, but even then. As a late game challenge though, the depths does pretty well. I say late game because although you're able to explore the depths at any time, it's best you do it after you have a sizable amount of hearts and know where at least most of the shrines are. Obviously not everything about the depths should be done in the late game, as there are some quests you'd probably want to get done as early as possible, but for the most part you'd probably want to do that later in the game. Sadly though, the reward for getting all the light bloom seeds isn't worth it compared to getting all the shrines, but I still think it's worth it in the end, just if you want to fill out all the map. Overall, I don't really think the depths are as fun to explore as the surface of Hyrule, but I don't really think it was meant to be, so I think the devs did a really good job. The last layer is the land above Hyrule. Sky region definitely brings a lot of parallels to the land in Skyward Sword, and for the most part, I really don't have much issue with it in Tears of the Kingdom. The thing that made exploring the sky so fun were just the amount of ways you can get around. You can launch yourself out of a tower and glide over to whatever island you're going for. You can build a literal flying machine to take you to whatever island, or with the islands that have the launchers, you can launch yourself on one of those. The amount of ways you can explore the air of Hyrule is just as much as the land. Sadly, there isn't really much to do on the Sky Islands. There are the 2 dungeons you can find, the labyrinths and the starting area, but outside of that are just little islands that populate the area. That definitely doesn't add a detriment to the game. Far from it. The world of Hyrule is already jam-packed with stuff to do, so I don't mind that the sky only has little sky islands. Sky is already pretty enjoyable to explore, and the big islands are definitely a lot of fun. All 3 layers of Hyrule add up to probably the best overworld in any game I've played. But before I move on to a different topic, I want to talk about some of the collectibles you do in the land. For one, Korok seeds are back. In Breath of the Wild, there are 900 Korok seeds you could collect to increase your inventory. Well, at least for a while, as you really only need about half of them to fully increase your inventory. There are definitely a lot of Korok seeds. In Tears of the Kingdom, they added 100. Personally, I'm not a fan of Korok seeds. I only did about 40 in Tears of the Kingdom, even though I played the game for about 100 hours, and in Breath of the Wild, I did about double that, but even then, I really didn't enjoy it. I mean, being able to increase your weapon storage is nice, but I really didn't think it was worth it to collect a ton of them, as you already can carry a decent amount of weapons already. Personally, I don't like collecting them, but I don't mind that they're in the game, as the reward for collecting some of them is nice, and since if you're looking for them there's so many, you're bound to come across them. Obviously, another thing you'd be doing in the world is side quests. NPCs will ask you to do stuff for reward, which is pretty par for the course for Zelda. But Tears of the Kingdom did make some slight changes, but pretty slim changes. Now, side quests got split into 2 different categories: side adventures and side quests, or as I like to call it, the good side quests and the lame side quests. Well, for the most part, as the one I'm doing right now on screen is the best side quest in the game, and it's only labeled as a side quest. For the most part, side quests are just getting items for people, and then they give you an item in return that's usually better. Side adventures are a lot more unique. They involve a lot more puzzle solving, including stuff like transporting people from one place to another with a build, or rebuilding Lurelin Village after you save it from the pirates. The side adventures were definitely one of my favorite things to do outside the main quest. Of course, it's not all black and white, as there are some fun regular side quests, and some lame side adventures. But Tears of the Kingdom making a distinction between the 2 types of side quests helped me a lot in deciding what quests I wanted to do before I beat the game. I'm going to save talking about the content of the shrines until a later point in the video, but I want to talk about some of the ways you get the blessing shrines, because there are a ton of them. A ton of shrines that have nothing in it except for reward for finding it. I know Breath of the Wild already had a decent amount of blessing shrines, but Tears of the Kingdom has way more, and they definitely weren't fun, especially if sometimes the puzzle for getting them wasn't hard at all. My least favorite type of blessing shrine was the crystal moving one, where you had to move a green crystal from one point to the next in order to activate the shrine. The puzzle was fun a couple times, especially where you had to use a flying machine to get the crystal, but there's just so many of them, I got annoyed, especially when I was shrine hunting, and I'd find them like 3 times in a row. It just got really repetitive after a while. Some of the shrines are pretty fun, like the ones in caves that were hard to get to was a pretty decent challenge sometimes, but there were a few in the overworld that literally just had an obstacle to get to it, like a sand pit in the Gerudo region for one. But if you just got into a tower and flew over there, you get it without any challenge at all. Again, this is sort of a problem with Breath of the Wild as well, but since Tears of the Kingdom has more, it was a bit more of an issue. Even with some problems like that, there really isn't any denying that the overworld of Tears of the Kingdom is the best of the series. It was bigger and better than Breath of the Wild's world, and that game was already streets ahead of the games before it. One of the most important parts about Zelda is getting key items that you can use to explore the world around you and defeat enemies. Breath of the Wild already had a very solid set. Remote bombs, magnesis, stasis, and cryonis were all very helpful on the playthrough of Breath of the Wild. But how does Tears of the Kingdom stack up to that? One of the 5 main abilities is called Ultra Hand, letting you take basically any material in the game and attach it to basically anything to make your own build. The way you move objects around is very similar to how you move magnesis in Breath of the Wild, but this is a lot more powerful because it's not just limited to metal objects this time. Now you can move just about anything and actually attach it to each other, making it the better version of magnesis in just about every way. Speaking of better versions, Recall is just a more powerful version of stasis in Breath of the Wild in just about every way. Now, instead of being able to stop time, you can now rewind it. So I guess it's fair to say it's more of an alteration rather than a definitive better version. But I don't know, I just had a lot more fun rewinding time than I did stopping it. Personally, I prefer rewind, but I guess it just comes down to personal preference. The next ability is Ascend, letting you travel vertically through platforms to get to the top. And although this is definitely a very useful skill, it is kind of a lot to get used to after being used to climbing everything. This was definitely the ability I used the least, not because I didn't want to, it's just that there wasn't really many applications for it, outside of being in caves or shrines. The last of the 4 abilities on the Great Sky Island to talk about is Fuse, letting you basically fuse anything to a weapon or shield. With that ability alone, it opens up a lot of possibilities for weapons. You can now attach spears to spears, which makes them even longer than they were before. You can attach a weapon to a shield to make it both a shield and a weapon. I think Fuse is by far the best ability in the game because it opens up a lot of possibilities for combat, making each weapon have a possibility to do something great, and it also being a lot of fun to mess around with. The last ability you get is Auto Build, letting you basically just create any build you've done before by using Master Hand, or using presets that the game gives you. I don't really have too much to say about auto build, but it definitely makes making builds with Master Hand a lot less tedious. Of course, those aren't the only abilities you gain across the course of the game. You also get a Sage ability every time you beat a dungeon. These Sage abilities work in the same way the Champion's abilities did in Breath of the Wild. Instead of being a button press or button combination to activate the ability, you have to walk up to the physical version of the Sage that walks with you in order to activate it, which devalues the usefulness of each Sage ability the more you get. The only exception to this is the Rito Sage, which, since it's mostly one you're going to be using while you're paragliding, you don't have to go up to the physical Sage and talk to it, you can just press A. On their own, the other Sage abilities aren't that bad. Rejuice lets you use a lightning arrow attack when you activate it. Unobos lets you mine in caves a lot easier. Sidon's water wall can act as a shield or an attack depending on how you want to use it. Mineru's mech is cool, and that's about it, but none of the abilities outside of Tulin's can really be used as much as Breath of the Wild's abilities. Having a physical version of the Sage walk alongside you as you explore the world is an interesting idea. Forcing you to go up to the Sage to actually activate its ability makes it tedious and basically useless to use. Before we move on from this point, I want to talk about Link's moveset outside of his abilities. Largely, between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there really isn't that much difference between how Link moves around. There are 2 major improvements though. You can now attach a material to an arrow to do more damage. Now, instead of fire arrows being in the game, you can collect fire fruit to be able to create one yourself, or attaching a certain monster part to make an arrow do more damage. Similar to that, you can now throw any material on an enemy. Although there's only a couple good materials to throw, the fact that you can throw anyone you want is pretty cool. Both of those new additions are very cool, but the only thing I will say about it is actually attaching something to an arrow or switching between materials to throw is very long, as if you have a lot of items, you have to cycle through a ton of different materials, which can definitely slow down the combat if you're going for more of a long-range attack. The rest of Link's core moveset in combat and exploration is the same as it was in Breath of the Wild. So, if you liked it in Breath of the Wild, you'll definitely like it here. To summarize my thoughts, I think Link's abilities are better than they were in Breath of the Wild, especially with the tutorial items, as I think they were very well utilized. Although I can't say the same for most of the Sage abilities, but since the tutorial items are far more crucial to the game than the latter, I definitely think it was an improvement over Breath of the Wild. I think it's pretty safe to say that Breath of the Wild had a pretty weak set of dungeons. The 4 Divine Beasts were all very similar to each other, and due to its non-linear structure, had very simple puzzle solving. Since your goal for the Divine Beast was to activate terminals to get them on your side, you could do these terminals in any order. While that's nice, some of the puzzles you're actually doing to get the terminals are stupid easy, like simply flying over a gap with your paraglider in Vah Meadow. On the flip side though, Hyrule Castle and the DLC dungeon were a lot of fun, but even still, 2 out of 6 doesn't really add to a good ratio. I did like Vah Naboris, the Gerudo dungeon, so I'll boost it up to 3 out of 6, but even then, that's not really a good percentage. So, how do Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons stack up? From a flat-out visual perspective, dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom stand out a lot more from each other, which definitely makes them a lot more memorable in my mind. If I had to choose my favorite dungeon design based on looks alone, it would probably be either the Fire Temple or the Wind Temple. But of course, looks aren't everything, so how are the dungeons as dungeons? First off, the Water Temple is probably the closest that Tears of the Kingdom gets to the old style of the Divine Beasts. Basically, all the puzzles you have to do in the dungeon are separated into 4 main islands that has its own individual puzzle that's not really connected to anything that came before it. The puzzles in the boss fight were fine enough, but it was definitely my least favorite dungeon in the game, as it really didn't do all too much for me. The next dungeon I did was the Lightning Temple in the Gerudo region, which, like its Breath of the Wild counterpart, is my favorite of the first 4 dungeons. The dungeon was a lot bigger than the other dungeons. It is 8 floors, and that's insane. I especially enjoyed it because the dungeon was definitely a lot more complicated compared to the other ones. Moving mirrors so that they can hit a certain target was definitely my favorite part of the dungeon, and the boss fight was very enjoyable as well. Third dungeon, Wind Temple, has definitely the coolest design in the game. A giant airship suspended at one of the highest points you can possibly go in the game was a very cool sight, and the dungeon is pretty fun as well. And for what's most people's first dungeon, the puzzles weren't brain dead easy. I actually had to think about quite a few of them. Favorite puzzle in the dungeon being when you had to attach some wall pieces to a pole to make a wind turbine to open up the terminal. The boss fight, while being the easiest one in the entire game, was quite a spectacle to play, as you diving into an enemy's weak point was really satisfying. Final of the first 4 dungeons was the Fire Temple, and I think this is a very quality dungeon. Similar to the Lightning Temple, this is a lot more sprawling of a dungeon map compared to the more simple Water and Wind Temple. My favorite part about this dungeon is that you're meant to go on a minecart to traverse it, since it's set in a mine. But what's cool is that you don't even really have to do that. If you're good enough at climbing, you can climb to the top of the dungeon and just ascend to wherever you want to go. This dungeon was definitely a blast for me to play. I don't think it was as good as the Lightning Temple, but it was definitely my second favorite dungeon in the game. After you're done with the 4 main dungeons, the game gives you a quest to go to Hyrule Castle, which technically serves as the game's 5th dungeon. Some people might not really consider this a dungeon, but since you get a heart container at the end, it having its own map like the other dungeons, and you can count Zelda leading you around like going to the 4 main terminals. But as a dungeon, this is kind of lame. Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle you can explore in any order you want, even going just on a full assault on Calamity Ganon. The freedom that Hyrule Castle gives you is definitely my favorite part about that dungeon. Tears of the Kingdom's version, though, is just kind of going wherever Zelda tells you to, in a certain order. You can't go to where she actually is because it won't let you until you do the other parts of the dungeon. And there really isn't any puzzles either. It's basically just a massive enemy gauntlet. But since that dungeon was mostly there for story purposes anyway, I don't really mind it as much. The final dungeon in the game is the Spirit Temple. Most of the dungeon takes place within the Construct Factory, where your goal is to rebuild the Sage's spirit by going to the 4 depots and collecting parts. The puzzles in this dungeon revolve around finding ways to get the parts out of the depot and back to the Construct Factory to build up the Sage so you can get out of there. To be honest, the Spirit Temple definitely wasn't the most memorable dungeon to me, so I really don't have much of an opinion on it. It was definitely a decent final dungeon, but it doesn't really compare to the other dungeons in the series. And that perfectly sums up my opinions on Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons. They're definitely a step in the right direction compared to Breath of the Wild, but they're definitely not on that level of quality that the older games had. But there is something I still gotta talk about before moving on. The shrines. Just like with Breath of the Wild, shrines are basically very, very small dungeons that you have to complete to get spirit orbs, which you can use for hearts or stamina. In Tears of the Kingdom, there are a few different types of shrines. There's a main type, puzzle shrines, where you have to solve puzzles in order to get to the end. There are combat shrines where you strip from all your items and armor, and you have to fight enemies with what you're given. Lastly, there are blessing shrines in the world that give you an item and a spirit orb, where the challenge only comes from actually getting into the shrine. Let's start out with that last one. Obviously, I already talked about blessing shrines earlier, but there are way too many of them. It felt like a third of the game's 150 shrines were literally just blessing shrines, which wouldn't be that big of a deal if the challenge you needed to do to get into the shrine was anything special. More often than not, it was just moving a crystal or going into a cave. But sometimes going into a cave and finding a shrine there wouldn't even lead to a blessing shrine, which makes it kind of weird that some cave shrines do, but sometimes don't. Sure, Breath of the Wild had a lot of them too, but I felt like there was a lot less compared to this game. The puzzle shrines, on the other hand, I enjoyed a great deal. A lot of them were quite a bit of fun. I especially enjoyed that there were a lot of shrines that taught me how to make new builds and how they can be used in the overworld, and similar shrines that taught me new fuse mechanics. What I like is that these shrines were short and sweet. They definitely were the perfect length, and compared to Breath of the Wild, I didn't really have a feeling that these shrines could have been longer. The last type are the combat shrines. In Breath of the Wild, the combat shrines were just tests of strength against an identical robot each time with sometimes different weapons. And there were a decent amount of them too, so it got really dull by the end of it. Tears of the Kingdom takes these and creates individual scenarios where your weapon setup is different each time, and you're stripped of all your weapons so you can't take advantage of those. It definitely takes inspiration from Eventide Island from Breath of the Wild, where you're also stripped of all your weapons and you have to use what's given to you in order to beat all the enemies. Sometimes the shrine will give you weapons that highly prioritize that you use bow and arrows, or sometimes they will want you to make traps so your enemies will die faster. It's definitely a lot more varied, and since it's taking inspiration from the best side quests in Breath of the Wild, I'm definitely happy about that. I've done all 150 shrines, and I definitely think they're an improvement over Breath of the Wild overall. Even though the shrines definitely aren't perfect, I definitely had a lot of fun playing most of them, the sole exception being the overly large amount of blessing shrines. Now we're moving on to the final section, the part of the game that Breath of the Wild does worse, and probably the biggest thing that Tears of the Kingdom need to improve upon. That being said, I will be talking about spoilers. I won't be talking about the ending specifically, but I will be talking about spoilers for the game overall. So if you haven't completed the story yet and care about being spoiled, I click off this video and come back to it later. Breath of the Wild definitely did change quite a bit when it comes to how the story was structured. Basically, all the cutscenes take place 100 years before the game begins, and you can get them in any order you want, since there really isn't much of a story in the present outside of being the divine beasts. As much as I enjoyed the more linear story of the previous Zelda games more, I think it worked pretty well for what Breath of the Wild was. Since the basic premise is that Link lost his memories after 100 years of sleeping in the Shrine of Resurrection, it makes sense that a major part of the plot will be him getting his memories back. But that being said, the story is still lackluster, even if it's kinda cool you can do it in any order you want. Tears of the Kingdom being a direct sequel, I was kinda hoping for more of an emphasis on storytelling, or at the very least a little more involved story. Tears of the Kingdom starts out pretty promising, Link and Zelda exploring the land below Hyrule when they come across a mummified Ganondorf as well as Zonai scripts. Ganondorf reawakens and then splits up Link and Zelda. Link then awakens on the Great Sky Island, he eventually gets off it, and gets his main goal to find Princess Zelda. And just like with Breath of the Wild, your goal is to go to the 4 main regions and explore the phenomena there, and explore the geoglyphs in Hyrule to get visions of Zelda in a distant past, which basically works as this game's version of memories. The main 4 phenomena honestly don't really have much story to them, you're just solving the 4 major races of Hyrule's problems, while seeing visions of Zelda act antagonistically. Once you do a few quests for leaders of each race, a dungeon will be unlocked that you'll do alongside them. Beating the dungeon will awaken them as a sage that will help Link out on his journey, while talking to the sage from over 10,000 years ago. Which honestly sounds pretty cool, and for me it definitely was in my first dungeon. But they reuse a lot of the dialogue for the rest of the dungeons, it loses its charm and becomes quite annoying, since the sages are basically all telling the same story, and the new sages are responding in the exact same way each time. But the stuff the sages are telling you are basically stuff you already know, especially if you've already done the geoglyphs. And that's not even just immune to the parts after the dungeon. This isn't the only time they recap the plot for you, which I guess is okay if you're playing the game over the course of a year or two, but as someone that played the game pretty consistently until I beat it, it got pretty annoying. But of course, the major phenomena aren't the main part of the plot, so now let's talk about the geoglyphs and the major twists. There are 2 major twists you can find to the kingdom. Let's talk about the geoglyph one first. Once you complete all the geoglyphs going into Zelda's journey in the past, you are greeted with one final memory you must go to. Zelda's main goals in these memories were to defeat Ganondorf, restore the Master Sword, and return back to her own time. During her time in the past, she is told that the tears that the sages have, if eaten, will turn them into a mortal dragon, losing all of their consciousness. Zelda, all out of options, decided to eat the tear that she was given, in order to become a dragon to get back to the present and give Link the Master Sword, even if it cost her humanity. Meaning that the new dragon that was flying around Hyrule was in fact her the whole time. And for someone that did all the geoglyphs pretty early into the game, the twist was pretty surprising and I think it did a pretty good job. And after completing that final memory, you're rewarded with 50 Silent Princesses, the flower that's meant to represent Zelda, making it probably the strongest story moment in the entire game. Completing that also reveals the location of the Master Sword, on top of the Light Dragon's head. And after retrieving the Master Sword, you agree to another cutscene of Zelda powering it up to its former glory. That is the order I did it, and I think that's probably the best way you should get it if you want to enjoy the story as much as possible. Sadly though, you don't have to do it in this order, and you can have the Zelda Dragon thing revealed without any of the setup, which I feel could definitely ruin the impact of that scene if you do it after. Now in this game, I don't really mind the non-linear nature of the memories. If you do it in chronological order, you still get a linear story, and it tracks pretty well. And even if you're like me and did the memories in a random order, it's still enjoyable. I went from the first memory in the game that you can possibly get to literally the last one. so instead of making me feel mad, it created a lot of intrigue to how it happened. But when there's two completely different ways you can receive the same twist, one with a lot less impact compared to the other, it definitely brings up some flaws with a non-linear story. The second major twist is the puppet Zelda twist. It ends up being revealed that the Zelda you are seeing in the present is merely a puppet made by Ganon to create destruction and lure Link into traps. Unlike the other twist, there's only one possible way you can find this one out: by completing the Hyrule Castle dungeon after completing the 4 phenomena. However, this twist was definitely the weaker of the two, because unlike the last one, this one is completely obvious, especially watching all the geoglyphs and seeing Ganon literally do that once. And leading up to it, it's abundantly clear that, at the very least, the Zelda you're seeing in the present isn't the one you actually know. So, as a twist, it doesn't really work all that well. Moving on from the twist, let's talk about Ganondorf as a villain. This is the first time that Ganondorf has been fully voiced in a Zelda game before, and the voice actor that did voice him did a really good job. Ganondorf in this game has a really deep and powerful voice that makes him a very intimidating villain. Sadly though, Ganondorf doesn't really get his chance to shine. The only time he's an active threat to the player is at the very beginning and towards the end. The only time he only shows up during those times are in the Geoglyph memories where he shows up in the past. That being said, Ganondorf is Ganondorf. He's one of the best video game villains in my opinion, and they definitely did a lot better job with him compared to Calamity Ganon. Before I conclude this video though, I want to point out how great the finale for Tears of the Kingdom is. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's definitely a top 3 finale in the series, and it was definitely one of the happiest I've been playing the game. Is it the best Zelda story ever? No, definitely not. The story definitely has flaws, and even then it's not the most exciting Zelda story ever. But in no way did it affect my enjoyment of the game, as story is not the most important thing when it comes to the newer Zeldas. What I kept going back to while writing the script for this video is that while Tears of the Kingdom improves upon many of Breath of the Wild's flaws and strengths, it is the better version of Breath of the Wild at the end of the day. I definitely appreciate that it tried to bring in a lot of more classic Zelda elements, but still has some of the same issues that Breath of the Wild did. That being said, this is still one of the best Zeldas ever made, and probably one of my favorite games. It does so many things well and has a world I can't even comprehend the size of. I'm not sure what the general fan consensus was online, because I really haven't looked into it that much, but I'm assuming it's rather high, and me criticizing some of its flaws might make it seem like I hate it. I absolutely do not hate it, but I did not want this video to turn into me fanboying for this game for 20 minutes while completely ignoring any of its flaws. But I will admit that the things that Tears of the Kingdom does well vastly overplays its flaws, as it did things that not many other games have. So in conclusion, this is an absolutely fantastic game, and I'd absolutely recommend it to anyone, but it's not quite my favorite Zelda. And that is my general thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom. With a game this massive, I couldn't cover everything, but as a good synopsis of my thoughts on it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed playing through Tears of the Kingdom. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.